So when we left off, we were on chapter 48. And we also found out, spoiler alert, Wyatt, if you haven't gotten to this part yet, Moon is all excited to get the deerskin hat that he made for Kit back to Kit. So Moon goes to the hospital to see Kit, and Kit's room is empty. He's not in there. And he comes to find out that Kit's actually really sick. He's in the ICU. That stands for the intensive care unit. And Moon's not able to go visit him. So Moon just like plops down on the ground and refuses to move. And after a couple of days' time, what ends up happening to Kit?
He dies.
Kit unfortunately dies. And it's pretty upsetting for Moon. I hate when stories do that to you. I like it, but at the same time, I was surprised but sad that Kit ends up passing away. So chapter 48 is where we left off. When we got back to the lodge, the sun had just set. I told Mr. Wellington I wanted to sleep outside that night, and he nodded that he understood. I took a yellow pad of paper and a pencil from inside the lodge, and I walked to the edge of the clearing. I scraped the leaves from the base of the juniper tree, and I sat against it and began building a small fire from its bark. Once I had the fire going, I took the pad of pencil, and I began writing to Kit. At first, I told him how much I missed him and reminded him that we were best friends. Afterwards, I began to tell him about when I was little. I started with the first memories of my mother, like a yellow finch beside me in bed at night. My first clear memory was of Pat carrying me on his shoulders up the trunk of a leaning gum tree. We sat in its branches and waited for deer in the dawn hours of a cold winter day. He hugged me into the warmth of his lap, and I could see his breath clouding over my head and dissolving in front of us. First time I killed a deer, I was 6. Pap cut open the doe's stomach and cupped his hands to bring out the warm and steaming blood. He brought it up to my face and smeared it so that it streaked past my ears and into my hair and became sticky and matted. I was proud of this time, and I told Kit all about it. It seemed that I was always watching Pap's hands. They were careful, powerful hands, and they taught me what I knew of survival in the forest. I told Kit about these hands and then about what they had taught me. I described the process of building a snare stick by stick. I described a deadfall for him, complete with pictures. I made a list of everything that went into skinning and curing hides. I listed the vegetables we grew, the best times of year to plant them, and how deep to place their seeds in the soil. I knew that Kit would want to know all of these things. Finally, I told Kit exactly what had happened to my Pap and what I felt when he died. I remember the daylight creeping into the forest that cold morning. Pap was already stiff by the time I could see his face in the light. My hand had rested on his cheek and felt it grow cold. I remember how cloudy it was and how much wind passed through the trees that day. I told Kit about struggling to get Pap into the wheelbarrow as the fog hung between the giant trunks of the loblolly pines and squirrels fussed at the struggle from above. I wrote and burned my pages of memories well into the night. It was late when Mr. Wellington came to check on me. I just want to make sure that you weren't planning on settling into your own ways again, he said. I shook my head. You have enough paper to keep that fire going? It's not to keep the fire going. I can keep a fire going without paper. Of course, Mr. Wellington said and held out a blanket. Well, I'm going to leave this blanket here if you need it. I shrugged. I got just about everything worked out with your uncle. He'll be here the day after tomorrow. I nodded. Well, I'll be in the house if you need me. I lay on my side in the leaves and I watched the last of the smoke curl away over the juniper fire. I listened to the wind in the trees and the needling of the insects and the settling of the birds in the brush. I trained my ears to filter all these things for some sign that Kit had gotten my message. I searched the dark shapes and patterns of the forest, hoping that they would turn into Kit's ghost. I was so tired that my eyes stung, and the last thing I remember that night was trying to keep them open. I saw Mr. Wellington leave in his truck the next morning. He returned in an hour, and he had Hal with him. The two of them walked over to me and stood looking down at my head. He's just been burning paper in the fire, Mr. Wellington said. He thinks he can talk to dead people that way, Hal said. Moon, we're getting worried about you. You got to get straight again. Nobody else liked him. Sorry, nobody else liked him, I said. I liked him, Hal said. Sometimes I gave him a hard time, and I shouldn't have, but I liked him, though. I don't think it works, Hal. What? This smoke stuff. Man, I told you that. I felt my throat swelling and tears sliding down my cheeks. He's by himself, Hal. Moody had the best time of his life out in that forest with you. He knew he was sick. He wasn't alone because of you. I looked up at Hal. Did he tell you that? That morning I left y'all in the forest, I tried to get him to come with me. I told him you might be crazy. I said you might get us all killed. You know what he told me? I shook my head and wiped my face. He said he'd never been happier in his whole entire life. He said he wanted to stay out in that forest with you no matter what happened. He knew he was taking a big chance. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand again. But I miss him, Hal. I know you do. Nothing wrong with that. Around noon, Mr. Wellington took Hal home again. When he returned to the lodge, I got up and went back inside. He made a sandwich for me, and I forced it down. I still didn't feel like talking to Mr. Wellington. Mr. Wellington said he understood. I lay on the sofa, and I watched television and everything it showed me of a world that I knew so little about. Gradually, I began to think of my new uncle. I began to picture him climbing trees and trimming their branches. I thought of my new aunt and pictured her like Mrs. Crutcher, the teacher back at Pinson. I tried to imagine what my cousins would look like, but images of Kit kept appearing, and I had to draw up my knees and roll over and blank my thoughts. Chapter 49. The morning my uncle was to come get me, I rose from the guest bed before daylight, and I left Mr. Wellington's lodge with Pap's rifle and deerskin hats. I walked into the forest. I made my way down a trail that was familiar only to my feet. It had long since grown over with honeysuckle vines and cane stems and holly branches and gallberry. I could tell where I was by looking up into the trees. The outlines of the branches made against the sky were burned into my memory like 1,000 lightning strikes. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and katydids. The creeks I had crossed gurgled in their dark cuts through the bottom. I stopped just beyond the shelter clearing. I closed my eyes and I listened to the forest, waiting for something. There was nothing. I opened my eyes and I continued. Daylight was starting to leak into the sky, and what was left of the shelter was a dark mound before me. I looked around and I listened, but still, there was nothing. I approached the shelter and stepped down into its hollows, which were not so dark anymore with parts of the roof missing. I shoved Pap's rifle into its old hiding place, and I hung the 2 deerskin hats on the wall. Finding a couple of the scattered animal hides, I stacked them in their old spot and I laid down on them. I listened and stared at the roots over my head. Still, nothing. The forest told me nothing. It gave me nothing. After the sun rose and the ugliness of the old shelter appeared around me, I stood and I left the dead thing. I put my back to it and I set out again. The Noxubee River seemed to be unchanged when I looked down at it from the cedar grove. I thought of Pap telling me that catfish the size of beavers swam on the bottom of it. I wanted to dive into its muddy water once and spear one until he told me that dead animals also float along the bottom. Pap and Mama's graves were undisturbed. Pap's was already rained smooth with pokeweed and pine sapling beginning to take hold. I didn't have anything to say to either of them. I just stood there and felt like all my insides had been scraped out. I knew that I would never come here again. I didn't go inside once I reached the lodge. I sat beneath the magnolia tree where I watched the driveway. Eventually, Mr. Wellington came out and stood over me. "It might be a while," he said. "I want to stay right here by this tree." He sat down beside me. "Moon, are you worried?" I shook my head. "No, I'm just ready to get on to wherever I'm going." "Well, I got the paperwork done. Your uncle's now your legal guardian." "He's my new Pap?" "That's right." I nodded and stared at the ground. I began plucking blades of grass and folding them between my fingers. "Hey, Moon?" I didn't look up. "Yes, sir?" "Moon, I think you're going to be happy where you're going." "Yes, sir." "Are you sure you don't want to come inside?" I shook my head. "I'll just stay out here."